Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Evaluating the Broader Impacts of Your Research. My name is Miles McNall, and joining me today as co-presenter is Sara Steenrod. Today, we're going to be talking about and providing guidance on how to build an evaluation plan for your broader impacts plan for your next NSF proposal. So let me quickly go over the structure of the workshop today. Sara is going to start out by reviewing some basics of BI for you. We'll go through that material fairly quickly, and then we'll get into the section on how to evaluate your broader impacts. I'll be talking about different types of evaluation purposes, types, and evaluation terms. And then I'll be introducing two key evaluation tools to help you build your broader impacts evaluation plan. We'll be talking about logic models, as well as evaluation planning matrices. We'll go through key elements of your evaluation plan using the planning matrix, and we'll end with some advice about how to find an external evaluator for your evaluation. With that, I turn it over to Sara.
Thanks, Miles. So today we're just going to start off with some of the broader impact basics. So first off, what are broader impacts and why are they important? And today we're going to be using the language and the framework from the National Science Foundation, but a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about today will be useful for other types of proposals. Next slide. So NSF uses two proposal review criteria for all of the proposals that it receives. The first is the intellectual merit, and that's defined as the potential for the proposed activity to advance knowledge and understanding within its own field or across different fields. So this is going to be the impact on science. The second criteria, which is going to be the focus today, is broader impact, and that's the potential for the proposed activity to benefit society or advance desired societal outcomes. Next slide. So broader impacts can be achieved primarily in three ways. So it can be through the research itself. So depending on your topic, achieving your research objectives may have a direct benefit to society. Second, it can be achieved through activities that are directly related to specific research projects, such as increasing the participation of typically underrepresented groups in the research itself. And third, broader impacts can be achieved through activities that are complementary to the research project, such as developing interactive activities to teach public audiences the fundamental concepts that are behind your research. Next slide, please. So to give you a more concrete idea about what NSF means by broader impacts, NABI, so it's the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, it's now known as PARIS, has identified 9 impact areas of desired societal outcomes. So those, we'll just go over those briefly. The full participation of women, persons with disabilities, and underrepresented minorities in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Improved STEM education and educator development at any level. Increased public scientific literacy and public engagement with science and technology. Improved well-being of individuals in society. Development of a diverse, globally competitive STEM workforce, enhanced infrastructure for research and education, increased partnerships between academia, industry, and others, increased economic competitiveness of the United States, and improved national security. So this is not to say that your broader impacts must achieve all 9 of these desired benefits to society. Rather, this list is meant to show you that the definition of broader impact is itself quite broad, and that many different types of activities can achieve these impacts. Next slide, please. So why evaluate broader impacts? Evaluating broader impacts is essential. So NSF states in their PAP guide that every proposal must include a section about its broader impacts and a plan for assessing them. Next slide. Fortunately, there are many resources to help you as you develop an evaluation plan. So one is from the group ARIS, so it's Advancing Research Impacts in Society. And they've developed this fabulous document called Guiding Principles for Broader Impact Development. And according to this document, the BI goals and objectives should be aligned with measurable outcomes, and methods for measuring attainment of those outcomes should be explicitly stated in your proposal. This is great advice. Next slide, please. So where does your evaluation plan go in your proposal? There's no set rule for this, but typically what we've seen that tends to work well is to include a separate evaluation plan for each BI activity. This evaluation plan should be a few lines at the end of each BI activity description, so each BI component, rather than having a separate evaluation plan at the end. And should include a few sentences that describe the intended outcomes, indicators, and effective and efficient methods for measuring them. Next slide, please. So here we can briefly walk through an example evaluation plan based on the MSU Science Festival. So here in yellow, you can see that the outcome is an increased interest in STEM careers among K-12 students who are members of underrepresented groups. The indicator in blue is the percentage of students who agree that their interest in STEM careers increased as a result of attending the festival. And the method to measure this indicator in green is using a post-festival online survey that can be accessed via mobile device and a QR code. Next slide, please. So reviewers really do care about strong BI evaluation plans. For example, these are actual critiques from proposals that weren't funded. The first, let's go through them quickly. The first states that there were missed opportunities for details of the formal evaluation, qualitative and quantitative, to examine the effectiveness and how this evaluation will be taken into consideration for refining activities. And the second states no discussion of metrics for measuring success of the graduate student throughout the project could be found in the proposal. And I think you'll find, especially after this workshop, that these are critiques that are really straightforward to address, and you don't want to get this kind of feedback on your proposal. On the flip side, we'll move to the next slide. Reviewers really appreciate strong evaluation plans. So these are actual critiques pulled from NSF proposal reviews. The first one says plans for these activities are well described, including details not only on content, but also strategies that will ensure effective messaging and wide dissemination. Outreach activities also include plans for assessment and build on existing infrastructure and previous efforts. And the second one says, learning objectives and associated assessment plans provide a strong structure to this course. Also, course assessment will be implemented to evaluate the experience of the students in the class. So reviewers really do know this. Next slide. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass this over to Miles.
So what I'm going to try to do now is attempt to help you get the kind of positive critical feedback that you just saw. So far we've been talking about evaluation in terms of NSF requirements, right? But evaluation shouldn't be totally about compliance with funder expectations. It should also be about answering your own questions about your BI activities. Just as you would through research, you hope to learn something from your evaluation. You hope to learn what's working, what's not working, and why. So think about this not just as an activity you have to do, but something that can be enjoyable and that you can learn from and learn to improve the quality of your BI activities through it. So I'm going to start now with just the absolute bare basics of what evaluation is and some key terminology in case any of you don't have any exposure to or experience with the field of evaluation. So one of the definitions of evaluation that's really stood the test of time, Michael Scriven came up with it in 1967, is a procedure that determines the merit, worth, or significance of something. So you can see it's much broader than just programs. It can be applied to just about anything. And often those judgments of merit, worth, and significance have to do with whether it achieves its intended benefits. So here are some other terms that you would want to make sure you use in describing your evaluation. There are two major purposes of evaluation. One is formative, and that is an evaluation that's conducted for the purpose of improving a program and preparing it for a summative evaluation. And then the second major purpose is a summative evaluation, which is conducted for the purpose of judging the merit, worth, or significance of a program. And one of my favorite ways of understanding this distinction is something, well, it's an evaluation joke, so they tend to be kind of dry. But Robert Stake once said at an American Evaluation Association conference, the way to understand the difference is when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative. When the guests taste it, that's summative. So in other words, you know, it's formative when the cook tastes it because the cook is still in the process of adjusting the seasonings, the proportions of different things and getting the flavor just right. But when the cook serves it to the guests, they're the intended beneficiaries of the soup, and so they will be the ultimate arbiters of its quality. Okay. So that's two main purposes of evaluation. There are also several different types of evaluation, and types are really dependent on what the focus of the evaluation is. So needs assessments, or also sometimes called front-end evaluations, involve gathering information about the nature and scope of a need. Process evaluations focus on project implementation or operations, and outcomes or impact evaluations focus on the extent to which intended outcomes or impacts were achieved. So those are some terms that you definitely want to use in your evaluation plan: formative, summative, needs assessment, process, outcomes evaluation, so that your reviewer understands what type of evaluation you're conducting. And Spencer developed a really nice way of looking at when to use different types and purposes of evaluation. So if you look at this table, you see as we move from left to right, we move from a time before a program or a BI activity even exists to a mature program. And as we move from left to right, we see different purposes. We move from formative to summative, and we see different types. So before a program begins, you might be conducting a needs assessment to determine the nature and scope of a need, the extent to which a need is being met, and what can be done to address it. And then as a new program is established, that's when you would want to conduct a process evaluation to determine whether it's being implemented and operating as intended. Once the program is somewhat established, that's an appropriate time to conduct an outcome evaluation, and not before then, because you certainly wouldn't want to be conducting an outcome evaluation of something that's still forming. And then once the program is fully mature, you might start to look at its impacts. What are some of the predicted and unpredicted long-term and broad in scope impacts of a program? So let's tackle some more evaluation terminology that you'll want to use in your BI plan. Let's start with goals. Everybody knows what goals are, but technically they are broad statements of the primary aims of a project, in this case, your BI activity. And goals are achieved through project activities. So continuing with our Science Festival example, our broad goal is increased interest in STEM careers among K-12 students who are members of underrepresented groups. So we move from goals, which are fairly broad, to objectives. And then objectives are the measurable steps that you take towards goals. And it's a good idea, in fact, it's a smart idea, to structure your objectives in SMART format. In other words, to make them specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to the particular goal you're trying to achieve, and time-bound. So here's a SMART objective example. By January 30th, 2022, a minimum of 6 middle school classrooms in the Lansing School District will be registered to participate in school-based science festival events during the month of April 2022. So this is an objective because this is something that needs to happen in order for me to achieve the goal that I stated earlier of increased interest. In order to have increased interest, we have to have middle school participants from underrepresented groups. The Lansing School District is majority underrepresented students in STEM. And as you can see, this example is specific, it's measurable, it's attainable, it's relevant, and it's time-bound. I specified the time frame in which this objective is supposed to be met. Another evaluation term is outputs, and these are often confused with outcomes. So outputs are direct products of program activities. So examples of these would be, say, the number of sessions, training, or events that you hold, the number of participants who attend or complete your broader impact activities, the number of artifacts created. So for example, today, you know, I love to create worksheets for these workshops. And so an output from today's workshop will be your completed worksheets, which you'll start working on in a minute. And outputs always contribute to the desired outcomes. So going back to our science festival example, that would be the number of science festival sessions, lectures, demonstrations held, and the number of participants at each event. That brings us to outcomes. And these are the results of goals being successfully achieved. And as I said a moment ago, outputs contribute directly to the attainment of your outcomes. And outcomes often involve changes in awareness, knowledge, skills, attitudes, behavior, motivations, beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And it can be among individuals, groups, organizations, systems, or communities. They should be measurable and they should be measured, and they can be short-term, intermediate, or long-term. So here's an outcome example, and it's going to look suspiciously like our goal. As a result of attending the MSU Science Festival, there is increased interest in STEM careers among K-12 students who are members of underrepresented groups. So outcomes often look like goal statements. And finally, that brings us to impacts. Impacts are very much like outcomes, but they're longer term and broader in scope than outcomes. And they usually reflect benefits to a target population or broader community due to the BI activity. So an example of an impact for the Science Festival would be increase in members of underrepresented groups employed in STEM careers. Okay, so we've gone from K-12 students getting more interested all the way through the causal chain to where they're actually now employed in STEM careers. So it's much longer term, and it's much broader in scope. So, and as we discussed before, these are some examples of those impacts. These are some of the ones that, that Sara just reviewed with you. So let's look at now 2 evaluation tools that are going to help you build your evaluation plan. We'll start with logic models. I'm sure most of you have heard of logic models. For those of you who have not, I'll go over it briefly. So we have a sort of causal chain from left to right. Some people also think of it in terms of if-then statements, if this, then that, as you move from left to right. We start on the left from the resources that you need to carry out your broader impact activity. Then in the next column, we have what the actual activity is. In the outputs column, we have the direct products of that activity. And we've talked about what some of those products are, the number of events, the number of participants, the number of artifacts created. And then we move into short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes or impacts, which cover changes in awareness, attitude, knowledge, and things of that nature. Moving on to changes in behavior, and then finally changes in the status or the condition of people or communities. As you recall, our impact example was for that population of interest, people who are underrepresented in STEM careers, that more of them now are employed in STEM careers. And I would argue that every good BI plan needs a logic model. Don't skip this step. It's really going to help you. And if you've not used one before, if you try it, I think you'll like it. It'll help clarify your thinking about how all the different pieces are connected. And you'll notice that a lot of the terms that I've used already are captured and linked together in a logic model. And that doesn't mean that you need to put the logic model in your proposal, but have it on hand to help you construct it. And you can mention also that you have a logic model. So here's one that's filled out. Well, not completely, because we only really have that one row at the bottom. And you might have multiple outcomes, and each outcome would have its own row. But for the Science Festival example we're using, in the inputs column, you have the resources you need. So you have your scientific expertise, your science communication skills, the materials and supplies you need for your demonstration or your hands-on activity. You need your K-12 attendees. And maybe you're going to have some students help you with this. Maybe your graduate students are going to be helping run the activity. And the activity itself is, in this case, and I'm just making this up, it's a hands-on engaging demonstration of basic scientific concepts from your field that are appropriate for a K-12 audience. And then your outputs are the number of students who show up. The short-term outcomes, that's the one we were talking about before. It's the increased interest in careers in STEM among members of underrepresented groups. And as a result of that, we hope then that they go back and they resolve to take more STEM courses in high school, that they participate in STEM majors in college. And ultimately, if everything goes correctly, we will see more members of underrepresented groups employed in STEM careers. So I want to talk a little bit about this outputs impact chain and its implications for measurement and the cost of measurement. So like you sometimes see in a restaurant menu, a single dollar means it's cheap, and $4 signs means it's really expensive. And as you move from measuring outputs to long-term outcomes and impacts, it becomes increasingly costly, which means that what you might actually measure are outputs and short-term outcomes. These are the kinds of things that you typically see measured in BI evaluation plans, because it's too costly to follow people and conduct longitudinal studies to see if, as a result of participating in your activity, they end up taking more STEM courses in high school and college, or end up in STEM careers. It would be really expensive to do that kind of study, and overkill for an evaluation of a BI plan, although it's certainly an interesting and important study in its own right. And the other thing to think about is, just because a student shows up for your BI activity at the Science Festival doesn't necessarily mean that all of this is going to happen. Your activity might not be that impactful, so it might not even be appropriate. So next, I want to talk about the key elements of your evaluation plan. These are the things that every evaluation plan should consider, but not all of them need to show up in your description of your evaluation in your proposal. So I'll highlight which ones I think need to be there. And we're going to use one of my favorite tools, the evaluation planning matrix. This is the ones I use have a few more columns, but this is certainly enough for today's purpose. So what I do is I stick whatever outcome I'm interested in measuring in the left-hand column. And then I think about what's the indicator for that outcome? In other words, what is the information that I need to gather to determine whether that outcome has been achieved? Then I need to think about my population, whether I need to sample from that population. And I need to think about my study design. What kind of design am I going to use in my evaluation? How am I going to collect data? How am I going to analyze data, and how am I going to report it? So those last two, data analysis and reporting, you would almost never find in a description of an evaluation plan for your broader impacts plan. And so we won't talk about those today, but those are important things for you to consider nevertheless. So we already figured out our outcome, and it is, again, increased interest in STEM careers among K-12 students who are members of underrepresented groups. So what's our indicator? Well, what are indicators after all? So here's how the CDC defines them. It's a specific, observable, and measurable accomplishment or change that shows the progress made toward achieving a specific output or outcome in your logic model or work plan. So our example indicator, and Sara actually showed this to you in that multicolored slide earlier. The way we're going to tell whether that outcome was achieved is by determining the percentage of K-12 students who are members of underrepresented groups who agree when we ask them that their interest in STEM careers increased as a result of attending the MSU Science Festival. So embedded within that outcome indicator is some notion now of possible methods and who the population is as well. So just to show you the difference between the outcome and the indicator, I've put them side by side here. So you can see that the indicator is much more specific. We're talking about percentage of students who agree that their interest in STEM careers increased as a result of attending the MSU Science Festival. So that brings us to activity 1. So hopefully you all have your worksheets ready. We're going to give you 5 minutes to think about what your outcome is. Now, you may have a specific BI activity in mind. So that will probably make thinking about your outcome a little easier. Or you may have several different ideas about BI activities, but pick a BI activity and think about what a desired outcome would be from that activity, and write that down in your worksheet, and then try to think about, given that outcome, what information would you need to gather that would tell you fairly certainly whether or not your outcome had been accomplished. We'll give you 5 minutes to work on it. It's 3:01 right now, so we'll give you until 3:06. And then if people want to report out and share, we can do that. That would also be an opportunity to ask questions. And if we don't have any volunteers, we can just quickly move on to the next section. So we will resume at 3:06, and I'm looking forward to hear what you came up with in terms of possible outcomes and indicators. Any brave souls out there who would like to share outcomes and indicators for broader impacts activities, or have any questions?
Yeah, I'll go for it. And so, yeah, I'm really targeting. I mean, as far as the outcomes, I'm looking to increase the awareness of different protein and genetic related vocabulary, as well as increasing the interests in biomedical related careers among kids that are actually pre-K. And so let's say ages 2 to 5. And so that's the general outcome I'm looking for, increasing the awareness of these, increasing the awareness of general terminology in this realm, as well as interest in careers in biomedical fields. And in terms of indicators, well, kind of just looking at, well, before and after, how aware are they? before any sort of activity is actually carried out, and how does that change after the activities?
Okay, very nice example, Daniel. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I have an outcome that I would like to develop. So I do molecular dynamic simulations, and I'd like to develop a lesson that facilitates students to use cloud high performance computing resources as a tool to understand membrane permeability. So how small molecules make their way from one side of a biological membrane to the other. So ideally, students would sort of develop a mental model of like how this actually works. And in terms of metrics, the most obvious one is how many times does this cloud resource get spun up? How many people are actually using this? Is it just me? Or has other people actually started to use it? As well as a Google survey to sort of break down demographic information that you may not be able to get just from how many times have people used this, sort of like what grade level are they at,
Okay.
And that sort of thing.
So that is what I would call an output. So the use of the resource. How would you know whether the people who are using it have gotten it, that they have a different understanding now of that issue around membrane permeability? Because that would be your indicator, is the information that you would be able to gather to tell you whether or not that change had happened in their mental model.
I mean, I suppose there could be a like quiz sort of thing at the end, hook that into the Google survey and just be like, okay, here, let's see how this works.
Yeah, I mean, you could use true false questions, multiple choice, all of the typical educational assessment tools that are available to us, or even more complex forms of assessing learning than that. Okay, well, thank you, Daniel and Josh, for sharing your work. I appreciate it. And I think it helps make it more concrete for the other learners here. So we've done our outcome. We've talked about our indicator. Now we need to think about our sample. And I need to just move the faces out of the way for a second here. Okay. So now that you know what information you must gather, determine whether your outcome has been achieved, in other words, your indicator, you also should have in that process developed some general idea of who you will need to gather that information from. In other words, you should have some idea about your sample or your population. So the first major consideration with regard to sampling is, can you include the entire population in your evaluation? And with many BI activities, the answer is yes, and so then you can stop worrying about sampling. If you have a well-structured activity and a set of participants that you have some contact with, you don't have to worry about drawing a sample. You can try to gather data from everyone. But if the answer to that question is no, then you have to think about your different sampling options. We usually prefer probability or random sampling because it allows us to generalize to an identifiable population. So if the answer is yes, that we can use probability or random sampling, then our options are or include a simple random sample. So that's just randomly sampling from the overall population. A systematic sample, that's a little different. That involves a random start and then a regular skip pattern. So for example, I think maybe 20 years ago, I used this in a medical clinic where we had a list of patient appointments over a month. So we had a list and we could pick a random start. So pick the person with the next appointment. And then we had our skip pattern, and our skip pattern depended on the size of the patient population and how many people we wanted to be in our sample. And then we would, after the random start, select, say, every fourth person to be randomized into either the treatment or control group. And so we did that for several weeks, and that's how we accrued our randomized sample. And then a stratified random sample, it involves dividing a population into smaller groups called strata based on shared attributes like gender or race. And this is something you typically want to use if you want to have equal proportions of groups of interest whose differences you want to compare. And then if probability of random sampling is not possible, there are several non-probability sampling options that are available. The problem is that none of these allow you to generalize with any level of confidence to a defined population. So there's convenient sampling, and that's merely sampling people who are fairly easy to reach members of a population. So say if I was at a science festival event where there are a lot of demonstrations going on and a lot of people moving through spaces, I could simply wander around with my clipboard and ask random people if they'd like to fill out a survey. Well, random, but not strictly random, right? That's a convenient sample. Snowball sampling is where you use enrolled research participants to help you recruit future participants. Purpose of sampling is sampling based on some expert knowledge of a population and your attempt to create a representative cross-section of that population. So we used this technique several years ago when we were doing an evaluation of school-based health centers. We knew that there were some major differences between school-based health centers based on whether they were in urban or rural locations, whether they were newly established or had been established for some time and in operation. And there was also variability in the extent to which they reliably and systematically collected Medicare billing data, which was one of our major data sources. So we set about developing a purposive sample to represent a cross-section of the different school-based health centers in the state. And then quota sampling is essentially a non-probability version of stratified sampling. The good news is that in most broader impact activities, you don't have to worry about all of these, but it's a good thing to be aware of nevertheless. So that brings us to activity number 2. We're going to give you another 5 minutes to think about this one. And that is, so given the outcome and the indicator that you just developed for yourself, what is your population? Will you draw a sample or a census? Census meaning you take the entire population that's been exposed to your broader impact activity. And if you sample, what strategy are you likely to use? And it is now 3:16. So we'll give you until 3:21 to think about this, work on your worksheet. And then, of course, when we come back together, I'll be looking for volunteers to share their thoughts and ideas. So we'll resume again at 3:21. Their population and sampling technique. If not, I will
Sure.
move on.
Yeah, I just kind of throw some thought there, and so again, I'm interested in increasing the awareness of different biomedical related vocab, as well as just like career pathways within kids that are basically between the ages of like 2 and 5, and so this would include like surveying the entire population of students that's actually exposed to the activity. And this would consist of like four classrooms within a single daycare facility with about 15 students per classroom. And so then the actual, so this would be like basically providing a survey to all of those students beforehand and all of those students afterwards. Does that work out?
Perfect. You didn't even have to worry about sampling because as you just showed with a lot of BI activities, you're not sampling, but occasionally you have to. All right. Anyone else? Okay. Let me move the faces over here and talk a little bit about what we did. So I have had the pleasure of serving as the evaluator for the MSU Science Festival for, I think, 5, 6, maybe 7 years now. Lori Van Egeren started it off, and I picked up from the very good work that she did. So what we did, and this is specific to what's called the Expo event. So back pre-COVID, we used to have a huge indoor activity in the chemistry and biomedical sciences building. I think that's what it's called. The two buildings are linked, and in that main floor corridor, there would be just all of these different tables and hands-on activities for all ages. And so we had a large number of people on Saturdays and Sundays moving through this space, and we used systematic sampling and what's called the Intercept Method. So the Intercept Method is essentially you draw an invisible line across a physical space, and then you capture people as they cross that line. So we used a skip rate of every 5th attendee, and that's how we drew our systematic sample for that, for the Expo event. All right. So we've got our outcome, our indicator, our sample. Now we need to think about our evaluation design. So evaluation designs are complicated. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for you. So evaluation designs answer 3 major questions. First of all, is there going to be an intervention? Well, in this case, yes, it's going to be your BI activity. So in that sense, it's like an experimental study. There's an intervention. It's not an observational study. And then the second question is, well, when are outcomes going to be measured? Are you going to do a pre-test, post-test only? Maybe you're really ambitious and you're going to use pre-test, post-test, and 6-month follow-up to see if there's any long-term changes. And then the third question is, so how many groups are there going to be? Is this going to be a single group design, or are you going to set it up as a treatment versus control group? So designs vary a lot in their ability to handle what are called threats to internal validity of your evaluation. So what is internal validity? Well, the technical definition, and this is the one I prefer, is it's the extent to which we can confidently infer a causal relationship based on the observed covariation between 2 variables in a study. So more practically, what that means is, how confident can you be that your BI activity, that's your independent variable, caused the observed outcomes, that's your dependent variable? How confident can you be? So here are all the scary threats to internal validity. So essentially, these are kinds of things that can happen over the course of time that may influence the outcomes in your study, and they're not actually your BI activity. There's something else. They're also referred to as confounds, right? So we have maturation as the first one. Well, people change over time. So it could be that there's some developmental process that's going on between, say, your pretest and your post-test, and it's that caused the change over time and not your intervention or your BI activity. Well, when you think about these, you have to actually think about whether they're plausible or not, right? So let's talk about I think it's Daniel's example. Yeah. So Daniel's going to do an activity and he's going to take a measurement immediately after it, right? Well, so how likely is it that maturation occurred over that time span? Not very likely, right? So we can just through logic, sort of rule out that maturation is going to be an issue. But if the pretest and the post-test are separated by a long period of time, and we're dealing with young people who are maturing very rapidly, then we have to worry about it. Well, history is very similar. So this is some sort of event that can influence your outcomes, but it is not related to your BI activity. Some strange thing happens in the world that shifts the outcomes that you're trying to influence with your BI activity. Attrition is also a concern, especially when your participants drop out in a way that skews the sample and affects the outcomes. So if the people who stay in are different from the people who you leave, you end up with a biased sample. We also have to be concerned about the regression effect. So if you have a pretest and people, some people have extreme scores on the pretest, there's a tendency for those scores to shift towards the mean so that the change you observe is not a real change, but it's merely the regression to the mean effect. Selection bias is one of the most serious. We all know about it, and that's what randomization is designed to prevent. It's when your groups are not comparable at the start of the study. Reactivity is when your outcomes are influenced merely by the fact that people know that they're being observed or measured. And then testing is when your pretest either sensitizes or changes in some way how people respond to your post-test. So we can think of different study designs in terms of how they afford different levels of confidence in drawing inferences about causality. And we can think of it as a continuum from high confidence to fairly low confidence. And as you can see, at the high end of confidence are the experimental designs with features like random assignment and control groups and either pretest, post-test, or post-test only. And those are sometimes referred to as the gold standard. I don't like to use that term because, experimental designs are not always appropriate or feasible. And then as we move down the continuum toward the low end of confidence, we encounter our quasi-experimental designs. They're called quasi-experimental because they have features similar to experimental designs, but they lack random assignment. And one of the most rigorous of those is the interrupted time series design. There are others as well that have been demonstrated to have results that are very similar to randomized designs, but I'm not going to go through all of those. Then we move down to the control group, non-randomized control group with pretest, post-test, control group, post-test only, all the way down to the single group design. So that is your continuum of confidence and causal inference. So let's look at in detail some of these designs, and we'll start again at the high end of the confidence continuum. So what we have here is we're starting with true experimental design 1. This is everybody's favorite. It's the pretest, post-test control group design. So what the symbols in the table mean are R stands for random assignment and NR for non-random assignment. O is the observation or measurement, X is the intervention. So what you see in this design is you have people randomized to treatment control groups. Both groups get a pretest, and then the treatment group gets the intervention. And then in this case, it's your broader impact activity. And then you measure both groups at the end and compare the results. So this one has a lot of strengths. It controls for all of the threats to internal validity we discussed earlier, except for testing, and that's because it has a pretest. Now, if you combine this with the next design I'm going to show you, which is called the Solomon 4-group design, you can also account for the testing effect. So true experimental design 2, that's post-test only. So you see it's identical in structure to the preceding one, except that it lacks pretest. So it controls selection bias because of randomization. It does not have a testing effect because you didn't have a pretest. But its big limitation is you really can't measure change over time unless you want to use what's called a retrospective pretest post-test design, which is essentially when you ask people before and after questions. You ask them about their attitude or knowledge of something prior to participating in some activity and after, and you ask both of those sets of questions after the activity. That's the retrospective pretest post-test design. And there's some debate in the literature about whether that works, but it's an option that I like and I've used in my work before. Then we get to quasi-experimental designs as we move down our continuum of confidence and causal inference. This looks exactly like the design we first looked at, right? Except the only difference is that people are not randomized to treatment and control groups. Instead, typically you're using natural occurring groups and comparing them. Its strengths are that it controls for maturation and history effects, but it does not control for selection bias unless you use some matching technique, like, for example, propensity score matching is one that's popular. And it doesn't control for the testing effect. Here is a very popular design in broader impact evaluation. This is the single group pretest post-test design. This is used countless times. Its strengths are that it allows for measurement of change over time. So that's positive. However, there is no comparison with the non-intervention group. So there's no what's called counterfactual, which is what would happen if everything else were the same, but you didn't get the intervention or you didn't participate in the broader impact activity. And so that list of threats for internal validity doesn't really control for any of those, right? So it's actually not that strong of a design, but it is ubiquitous. And that brings us last and least to the single group post-test only design. This is also very popular. You see this a lot, post-test only. So you have a single group, there's no randomization, no comparison with the counterfactual, doesn't allow for measurement of change, unless you use a post-test only design with retrospective pretest post-test. Doesn't really control for any threats to internal validity. And so strictly speaking, valid inferences about causality are not possible with this design. However, causality is not the overriding concern all of the time. Maybe you just want to know how attendees experienced or reacted to your event. I mean, that's legitimate too. So, causality is not the end all and be all. And then you need to consider really for yourself, well, how important is internal validity to me? Okay, so it depends. So how confident do you want to be that your BI activity caused the observed outcome? If that's really important to you, then you probably want to use one of the designs where you can more confidently infer causality. And the other consideration is, how confident do you want others to be that you have solid evidence of outcome or impact? Who's your audience, right? And do you want to publish your results? Because if you want to publish your results, then there's a different standard that's going to apply. And I encourage all of you to think about publishing about your broader impacts activity. It helps build the field. So far I've only been talking about quantitative designs, quantitative methods, and that's not the only way to assess broader impacts. There are plenty of qualitative designs. such as phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, case study. But in my experience, these are really uncommon in broader impact evaluations. It's really uncommon to see these designs. What is much more common is to see qualitative methods being woven in with quantitative methods in what's called mixed methods designs. And so, I encourage you to think about, if you're using a quantitative design and quantitative methods, what else could you get out of it by including interviews with participants, maybe focus groups, conducting observations of say, in a museum space, how people are interacting with exhibits. There's a whole field around this called visitor studies, maybe analyzing documents, maybe using photo voice techniques where you use a prompt question, ask people to explore a topic by taking pictures in response to a question prompt. So that brings us to activity 3. We'll give you 5 minutes to think about what kind of evaluation design, given what you've shared already about your outcome and your indicator and your sample, what kind of design are you likely to use? Experimental, quasi-experimental, non-experimental? Maybe you're going to use a mixed methods design. You're going to combine quantitative designs with qualitative designs or methods. So we'll give you 5 minutes as usual. So we'll see you, we will resume at 3:43. I want to share their thinking about their evaluation design. This is probably.
So I can, oh, sorry, Daniel, go for it.
Go ahead, Betsy. Sorry.
Oh, so that's fine. So I'm thinking about a broader impacts event that my research group is planning to do with a local library. That's basically, the goal of it is to increase dialect awareness and sort of appreciation. And so this has been a challenge for me thinking about how to evaluate this. And I've been thinking mostly about a non-experimental mixed methods approach, ideally collecting, kind of in the photo voice realm that you mentioned, collecting participants' sort of reactions, like what kinds of things do you say that mark you as a Michigander or as a young person or whatever, and like what's cool about that? Sort of this like much more open-ended, free response. What do you think is cool about your own language? But I actually would love to get some feedback on that because it's not as clear of an evaluation as some of these other methods.
Well, I would be happy to talk to you about that later. That's one of the things that I like to do, is to help people develop their evaluation plans for their broader impact activities. So please, please let's connect later.
Cool.
Yeah. Anybody else? And by the way, I love the fact that you're using a photo voice technique. All right. So how about if we push on through to the end? So let me get going here. Okay. So we're in our last column for today, data collection method. You're going to be familiar with a lot of these. So we all know about common data collection methods: surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations. A lot of this stuff lately has moved online. So for the Science Festival, when we were participating in a funded evaluation by the NSF, we actually had big containers of iPads shipped to us, and we would wander around the Science Festival and use that Intercept method to identify people and then give them a tablet to fill out the survey. And that just makes life so much easier because you can build in safeguards to make sure your data is clean. You don't have to do data entry. So that's, if you can do that, that's really the way to go. This year, what we're doing is for in-person science festival events, we're posting QR codes so people can just complete the survey by pointing their phone camera at the QR code and launching a survey in Qualtrics. So that's a great way to go. But don't rule out paper, because if you have an in-person activity and you can give people a paper survey, you're going to get a much higher completion rate, I've found. I mean, yes, it's a pain because then you have to enter the data from the paper surveys. But if you want to make sure that you're getting data from all of your participants and you're physically there in the room with them, all paper surveys are still a great way to go. And then, of course, if you're conducting a survey, you have all of these wonderful choices from different types of survey questions: open-ended, closed-ended, response options that involve rating and no rating or ranking, or rating and ranking. One caution is try to keep the number of open-ended questions low, because you'll find that if you put a lot of them in, not only will Qualtrics give you a bad score for your survey. I love that feature of Qualtrics. It actually evaluates the quality of your survey. People are just not going to finish it. So one of the things that I have found really relevant for BI outcomes is thinking about science communication outcomes, because they're really applicable to a lot of different kinds of BI activities, because almost all of them involve communicating science, right? And I love this mnemonic device that Burns, O'Connor, and Stockelmeyer came up with, using the old A-E-I-O-U mnemonic from the vowels in English. So we have measures related to awareness of science. A couple of you have mentioned that already today. Enjoyment of science, interest in science, opinion forming towards science, understanding the content and process of science, which is really critically important and probably underdone in assessment of BI related learning. And then I would add to that at the bottom, intention and motivation are important too. And I shared some examples of that before, like maybe you ask young people who attend your events, do they intend after attending your event to go and find out more about this topic, look things up online, go to their library and check out a book, if anybody does that anymore. Or is there an actual change in behavior? I mean, that's the holy grail that we're after, right? That this all leads to some change in behavior. And so just as an example of one kind of survey that was fairly easy to put together is that I was part of a team that built this survey for the Isotopes in Motion student survey. That was the activity that was supposed to happen as a partnership between EFRIB and a local dance company. It's still going to happen. But we designed some questions in a post-test only survey, asking about, interest in studying science, interest in a career in science, increased confidence in ability to succeed in science, and these kinds of questions as a result of attending the activity. So it's a post-test only design, but these are the kinds of questions that you can ask and that are quite common in broader impact evaluations. Given the time, I think we'll skip over activity 4, which is the data collection method. I'll let you contemplate that on your own. Whether you're going to use surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, or some combination of those things. But let's go back to the evaluation planning matrix, and I encourage you to think about using this and the logic model as your tool to evaluation plan planning tools, and to think through those last 2 columns too, because if you're going to gather data, obviously you should have a plan for how you're going to analyze it, and also who you're going to report it to, when, who the audiences are and what their preferred formats are for receiving that information. Just a word about evaluation and institutional review boards. So you all know that research that involves human subject requires IRB review and approval. And you probably also know that evaluations are often exempt because they're not considered research. They don't produce generalizable knowledge in the opinion of the IRB. But my advice to you is not just to assume that because it's an evaluation activity, it's exempt. Let the IRB make that determination. There's a simple form you can fill out if you go to the hrpp.msu.edu website that allows them to determine whether the activity is research or not. And it's a very short turnaround time, but don't get yourself in the situation where you're actually out there doing something that looks a lot like research to the IRB and they don't know anything about it. Very often you will want to enlist the services of a professional evaluator, especially if it's a larger, more complex evaluation design. There's several different ways to find evaluators. You can contact me and I can try to help you. I have connections with evaluators at MSU and in Michigan and in the US. Ask your colleagues if they've had success working with external evaluators and who they are. There are a couple of online directories you can look up. You can look at the directory for the Michigan Association for Evaluation at maeval.org/directory. That's one place to look. And you can also look at the American Evaluation Association Find an Evaluator directory at eval.org/community. So those are good places to go to find evaluators. And you know, in every session, I like to talk about these wonderful tools that ERIS has created for you. In fact, we're going to try to get involved in the BI Toolkit project so that we can provide direct training to you on these. There are 4 main tools here. We mentioned the guiding principles document. That's for people who are new to broader impacts. That's the first thing I direct them to. And I think Sara said that as well. There's also this wonderful planning checklist. So, you know, it helps you think about what are the key elements of a BI project. The BI wizard, as you work your way through it, helps you build your BI project proposal. It actually spits out a draft proposal at the end. And then there's a rubric you can use to assess your project's potential and how it's likely to fare in the proposal review process. This is a good time for any final questions. We can share the slides with you after the session. And when we close out the session today, a survey should pop up. Please complete that. We love to have your feedback. We're always evaluating our own work and really take your comments seriously and trying to think about how to make these kinds of sessions work better for you. With that, I'm going to stop the share and see if there are any questions. Well, apparently, Sara, we were 100% clear on everything we said.
I have a quick question I put in the chat. Are these slides available to us after the fact as well?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
We can send you a PDF version.
Thank you.
All right.
I have a question as far as like, I guess as it relates to, I mean, yeah, NSF proposals and avoiding getting dinged for like, oh, this looks like it's too similar, or this would be well suited for some NIH funding. And so if my work, if like a broader impact that could come from my work involves like, facilitating drug discovery. And so if that's something that I want to include like within a broader impact, then like, do I need to still come up with like a way to evaluate like that potential outcome? I mean, it's more obvious, like in a sense of like having these separate like educational plans and activities, but for that kind of a broader impact, that yeah becomes much less clear.
I'm going to defer to Sara and Angie on this because they're really the proposal development specialists.
Danny, I would say it kind of depends a lot on what you're actually proposing and keeping the evaluation focused on the part that you're going to do. So you're not necessarily going to do the drug discovery yourself, or that would be like a separate research project, right? But there may be things that you're doing, like putting on a workshop or disseminating this information and making sure that people who are doing drug discovery are aware of it. So maybe that's something that you could focus the evaluation on. That would be my take. I don't know if you would agree, Miles.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, just as far as framing it as like, okay, what am I actually proposing that I'm going to be doing? Yeah, thanks.
If there are no further questions, I'm going to wish everybody a good afternoon. All right. Thank you all for coming, and please fill out that survey when it pops up on your screen. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.